Okay, so hi, welcome to this episode of Use Because Mashup. What we do is we take two books that we've done podcasts on and we compare them and we contrast them and we see, are they in agreement about whatever the topic is, or are they in conflict with each other? Now, the two books that we're going to look at today, we've done podcasts on them. One is called The Captain Class by a guy called Sam Walker, and the other guy is James Kerr, who wrote a book called Legacy. And what's interesting with these two books is that they overlap a lot, right, when it comes to leadership. A lot of the time when we think about leadership, we think it's the person who can tell the best stories, the person who leads from the front, the person with the most charisma, the person with the most skills, the biggest skill set. And really what they talk about in both of these books, in Legacy and in The Captain Class, is they talk about how leadership might not actually be what you think it is, or more specifically, the leaders in a team, they might not necessarily be the person who's the captain or the person who is the star player. And this relates to both sport and to business as well, that the person with the biggest skill set, the person who has the most ability, is not necessarily the best person who should be in the position of leadership, or they're not necessarily the person who is the leader. A lot of the time in leadership, it's the quiet spoken person. It's the person who is willing to do the thankless jobs, the person who is not the loudest talker, the person who goes up against the rules, will bend the rules as far as possible in order for the team to win. And that's what's interesting about both of these books, both in The Captain Class and in Legacy. They talk about what leadership is in a team, in a sports team. I'll just explain briefly what the two books are about, and you can listen to both of the podcasts at usebecause.com/podcast, or buy the books and read them yourself. This one, The Captain Class by Sam Walker. It's what he did was the first part of this book is about basically who are the top teams in the world across all sports, right? Across every different sport you could think of. What he did is, I think, as far as I can understand from reading the book, he just did a search on the internet of who does everyone else think the best teams are and why, and had a massive big layout on his kitchen table or wherever it was that he did it, and he came up with some very stringent criteria as to what would count as a top sports team. I'll give you a few of the examples, just so he does know what he's talking about in this book. But to give you a few examples of how stringent he was for picking a team, or picking a top sports team, a freakish team as he calls it, is that they had to have at least 5 players in the team. They had to ensure that they had an opportunity to compete at the highest level, that they were actually competing against another team, and that it was happening over a sustained period of time. And he came up with 16 teams, tier 1 teams as he called them, across all sports. Like there was handball and rugby, soccer, water polo, I can't even think, ice hockey, American football. Right back, I think the earliest teams like the 1920s, like the New York Yankees or something like that in the 1920s, right up until maybe 2015 or 2016. But what's really interesting about it is that in this book, one of the teams he talks about is what this book focuses on, Legacy. So Legacy by James Kerr, he focuses on the New Zealand rugby team, also known as the All Blacks. And he followed them for basically 2 years and wanted to understand what was it that was making them so dominant, what was it that was making them so unbeatable, that people would just show up and assume that they would be beaten by this team. And so he spent 2 years following this team around, but this team that he spent an entire book on makes up one of the 16 teams in Sam Walker's book, in The Captain Class. So that's one massive overlap for the two books. But one of the things is, let's start with the Captain Class. One of the things he does in this book is he talks about the fact that sometimes when we're raised from children into adults, we're taught to respect authority, and sometimes that can fall over into sport, where you assume the authority, as in the coach or the manager, who the person who picks the team, that they're the brains behind the operation, whether it's Bill Belichick for the New England Patriots, or Alex Ferguson at Manchester United. He was there for 26 years and delivered all sorts of trophies. But he talks about how it's an important factor. They have to have something. They have to have some sort of charisma, some ability to push these people on to achieve on the pitch. But that's kind of the point. It's that the manager doesn't actually throw the ball or kick the ball or do the thing. What he needs on the pitch is a proxy, somebody who can enact his will on the pitch. So Bill Belichick, right, the New England Patriots manager, his proxy has been Tom Brady for the last whatever amount of years, and Tom Brady has left New England Patriots now recently. But he, like, it's the two. It's like there's a symbiosis between the two of them, where they share a brain or a mind. The guy in the pitch has the physical ability to do what the brains behind the whole thing wants him to do, and they're in sync the whole time. That's the point. But he says that, let's actually take, for example, Tom Brady. He, in the book The Captain Class by Sam Walker, he talks about the fact that just because somebody is the superstar, they aren't necessarily the leader of the team. And there's a quote in the book from Roy Keane, the Manchester United captain back in the day, and he says a lot of the time what the media think is the leader is absolutely not the leader in the dressing room. It's the quiet person. And he talks about in The Captain Class how and it gives all sorts of examples from all these teams. People who, like I said, were not naturally gifted, but they were willing to do what he calls the thankless tasks, to be a water carrier, to be the person who will. I'm just thinking of an example here. Didier Deschamps, right, who was the played for the French national soccer team, midfield player, and he was not spectacularly gifted. He was like 5'7", but his job was to control the pace of the game. So he had no problem performing that task, whether it was like passing a ball 3 or 4 yards. His job wasn't to score the spectacular goals. His job was to set up those things for Zinedine Zidane or whoever it was, and he was happy to do that job because he understood that's what it should be. There has to be somebody in that role. It can't all be superstars. And there's a quote from him in the book that says, "We can't all be architects. We need bricklayers as well." It's like if you're building the Sydney Opera House, you can't all be architects. Somebody has to lay the brick. Somebody has to do the physical jobs, those thankless tasks. He makes a point in the book as well that the superstar is not necessarily the leader, but generally the person who is that water carrier, that person who's doing the thankless jobs, they almost always rise to prominence in the team, either to become the leader or the captain of the team, or to become the person who is most respected on the team. Another one I can think of is Puyol for the Barcelona team. The Barcelona soccer team is another team mentioned in the book. That his job was he was a central defender. This isn't. I don't want to talk about sport. I don't even follow that many sports myself, to be honest. But I understand the concept of having these players in the team who will just grind through what needs to be ground through, basically. That they're not looking to make the spectacular passes or to be the center of attention. And most of the time when these people are interviewed, that they're not particularly good interview subjects because they don't have a lot to say. They like to win. So let's jump over then to Legacy by James Kerr. And in this book, he talks a lot of the same things. So I think there's 15 chapters in Legacy. Each chapter finishes with a key takeaway, and we talk about these in the podcast on this as well. And I'll give you an example of one of the things that he talks about in this book. So this New Zealand team, right, that if you don't follow rugby, they were dominant for a long time, and they still are fairly dominant. They're beatable. Ireland beat them a couple of years ago, I think. But for a long time, they were just untouchable. And that was the time that the author, James Kerr, was following them around. And he wanted to see, well, what was it that was making them so good? One of the things that they did after every game is they would have a debrief, what they would call like a Maori wear, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And this was like a traditional thing where all the media, all the politicians, all the celebrities' children, everybody had to leave the dressing room. And all that was left was the core team and the management. And they would have a very honest debrief of what was good about the game and what was wrong. Win, lose or draw. And it was generally winning. for them, and everyone would get to say their piece about what went right, what went wrong, and it was just no holding back kind of thing. But what was really interesting is that, and this is the name of the first chapter in this book, Sweep the Sheds is the name of the chapter. What was really interesting, that after this debrief, the players would disperse, go and have their showers and get dressed and whatever. But the most senior players on the team, they'd stay behind and they'd clean up the dressing room. These players who were household names, if you follow rugby, these were like Richie McCaw and Dan Carter, and these players who were, like I say, household names, they'd stay behind and clean up the dressing room. And the point is that you should never be too big to do the small things. That's what he says about sweeping the sheds. The sheds is what they call their dressing rooms, the changing rooms. You can never be too big to do these small things. Humility is what makes a great leader. Of course, it's about leading from the front, but it's about never being too big to do small things. So when you think about either you as a leader in your team, or if you're trying to select a leader. Now, I've seen this countless times where you see a sales team of 10 people or whatever, and the best salesperson gets promoted to manager. Like, it's a completely different skill set. Being the best salesperson doesn't mean you're going to be able to be a good manager. It might, but the two are not equated, right? You can't assume that because somebody's good at sales, they're going to be a good manager or a good leader. So what you're looking for in leaders is the people who will just either grind through what needs to be ground through, the people who will put their arm around somebody when needs be, or kick somebody up the arse when needs be. And that's what he talks about in the captain class as well. He talks about ensuring that your leader wants to wipe noses and kick asses, I think is how he puts it. It's been able to do the right things or say the right things at the right time. And that's what this is about as well in this book. Humility is a key component of leadership, but it's also ties in with what he says in the captain class. He says that you have to ensure that there's an awareness, I suppose, of what's needed for each individual player. And he also said that I think it was I can't actually remember now, which it was one of the books, I think it was the captain class. He says that the leaders of these teams, or these people he identified as the leaders in these teams, these quiet individuals who would just get on with the tasks, they doled out their communication to every player equally. And every player got the same amount of attention, whether it was an arm around the shoulder, a quiet word in their ear, whatever it was. These people who he identified as the leaders were able to communicate in a way that the brash big talkers weren't or didn't. I think that was very interesting as well, that these leaders are almost flying under the radar. So you need to, when you think about your own teams in your professional life, you need to think about who are the people who don't say much in meetings but are consistent, or the people who, when the meeting is over, are able to kind of have a few words with somebody and make sure somebody understands whatever needs to be understood. That person could be your leader. It's a different skill set than being able to perform the task brilliantly. You look at any of the players that he mentions in the captain class as leaders. They generally weren't superstars. They generally were very quiet to the media. They generally didn't want attention. They hated being famous. They didn't want any of that. They just wanted to perform in a team. They wanted the team to win. So he talks about them having 7 traits of leadership. That's in the captain class. But legacy as well, he also talks about, I guess, the idea of these mashups is to make sure that there is an understanding of whether there's overlap or conflict in these two books. I am firmly in the camp that these two books overlap and that they complement each other brilliantly, because this is like an in-depth for the legacy book is like an in-depth version of the captain class. So what else does he say in legacy? In legacy he talks, like, it's a lot more hands-on, deliberate, actionable content. I would say, for example, when it comes to playing the game, or when it comes to leadership in general, play where the ball is going to be, not where the ball is right now. I think Wayne Gretzky said something like that as well on ice hockey about be where the puck is going to be, not where it is right now, that kind of thing. Let me just have a quick look. I think we've covered a lot there in what I've said. Humility, I guess, in legacy, humility is like, for me, is what I took away from this book, that humility has to be your starting point so that you continuously remain as a student, that you never consider yourself to be a fully formed expert on anything, whether it's a piece of software that your company uses or, interactions with customers, whatever the thing is. It's important to always remember to be a student, whether it's entering negotiation, you say, well, I've done this negotiation 100 times before, I know exactly how this is going to go. It's making sure that you're forever a student, and the way you do that is by remaining humble. So what they were able to do with the team, the All Blacks in Legacies, they were able to I guess, build this culture of humility to make sure that everyone understood what leadership was and that they were self-contained. One of the things that he talks about as well when it came to sweeping the sheds was that they wanted the team to be self-contained. They wanted the team to not have to rely on anybody else. And there's a great quote from, not a quote, it's a story that Jocko Willink tells. I don't know if you know Jocko Willink. He's been on the Joe Rogan podcast a lot, and he has his own podcast now as well. But he's an ex-Navy SEAL. And he used to not just be a Navy SEAL, but actually train the Navy SEALs as well. And he said when he'd be out on missions and there'd be a meeting, with the higher brass, whatever they call them, the brass, or the person in charge, would go around each of the captains of each of these units, whatever they're called in the Navy SEALs, and he'd ask, he'd say, what do you need? Well, my men need more boots because, we're entering in a different terrain, we're going to do different types of boots, and you go through each of these leaders. And when they got to Jocko Willink, Jocko would always say, I'm good, everything's fine. And he always wanted to make that point that I'll figure it out. Whatever needs to be figured out, I'm not going to make it a problem for you because my team is self-contained. So then he said he'd know when his boss heard something from Jocko to say, well, okay, well, we do really need this. Well, Jocko hasn't asked for anything in the last 10 meetings. He must really need this thing. He wanted his team to be self-contained. That's what made him one of the best Navy SEALs. And I guess that's ultimately a concept we can take forward when it comes to leadership and what we want from our leaders. We want to build a culture of that self-containment, and within that self-containment is this ability to remain humble while confident. I think there's some company out there that calls it humbledant. I think is it Zendesk or one of those. They talk about being humble and confident at the same time, and that's really what you're looking to do. And it's really, really well put forward in both of these books. I introduced the podcast to the captain class, and it actually says it there on the tagline, a great leader is not what you think. And that sounds kind of clickbaity, like the results will surprise you kind of thing. But leadership might not actually be what you think it is. The best salesperson does not necessarily make the best leader. The loudest person is not necessarily the best leader. The person with the most the person with the best stories and the best charisma might not be the best leader. They might be in your team, but you need to keep your head in a swivel. You need to make sure that you're aware of other opportunities, the people who are flying under the radar. I'd recommend reading both of these books, listening to both podcasts, and leave a comment if you think if I've left anything out of these books, or if there's anything you agree with or disagree with. Let us know. Hit that subscribe button as well for us. And tell 2 people that you know about usebecause.com /podcasts, usebecause.com. Go to the courses page as well. There's a couple of courses there. What we do is we make sure that you are able to understand, remember, and deliberately practice the actionable content from the best business books out there. So until next time, thanks very much. As always, a pleasure. It's great to be able to do this as a job, to read books and tell other people about them. So until next time, right, thanks very much. We'll see you again.